Lovely to be here with you all. I bring greetings from another St. Paul's. We've got a better dome than you've got. You've got better stained glass than us. So I think it evens out. So I'm a canon at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and spend my life doing all sorts of interesting and fascinating things. But one of my favourite things to do is to come and preach at other people's churches. So a huge thanks for the invite. It's really fun to be with you. And today, what I want to do is to introduce you to a woman from the Old Testament that I'm pretty confident most of you won't have heard of. And can I just say, and my congratulations to Bruce as well. I am so sorry for choosing a reading with such terrible names in it, but there's a really good reason for it. And what I hope to do today is to introduce you to one of my absolutely favourite women from the Old Testament, who I think is remarkable and teaches us a lot about how to live faithfully when times are hard. So I hope that you will learn a lot about Rizpah today from our story. I've called my sermon on doing what you can. And there is actually something really important about that. I don't know about you, but if you look around the world today, making a difference feels quite impossible. You look at the stories on the news, you hear about the things that are happening in politics, you think about all the wars that have broken out, even in the space of the last 5 years. And if you want to try and make a difference in the world, it's actually really tempting to go, actually, I don't think I'll try, because there's nothing I can do. There's absolutely nothing that little me can do to make a difference. The story today tells us something really important about what you can do to make a difference. And it's just this. If you remember nothing else from the rest of today, remember this. Do what you can. And if you do what you can faithfully for God, you will make a difference. There you go. Shall I stop now? Shall I go and sit down again? Let me carry on. And I want to tell you a little bit about this story because, like I say, it's a story that most people haven't come across, and it will gives you a little sense of some of the stuff that goes on in the Old Testament. The first thing to notice, this won't make any difference to most of you, but it is just a little interesting thing to notice, is that this story is out of place in the Old Testament. So this story comes from the time when David had first become king. So it was right at the start of his reign. And if you know your 1 and 2 Samuel, then you would know that actually this story ought to be either at the end of 1 Samuel or the beginning of 2 Samuel. That's where it ought to be. Instead, it's right at the end of 2 Samuel. And it tells you something about the importance of this story. It's almost as though the person who wrote 1 and 2 Samuel wrote it, and then somebody at the end went, yeah, but what about the story of Rizpah? You've missed the story of Rizpah out. And he's gone, well, it's too late now, I've written it. And in those days, as well as you probably know, the texts were written on scrolls. So you can't cut and paste, and you can't kind of edit. So the easiest thing to do is add it on the end. And it really does feel as though those who were compiling the Old Testament said this is too important a story to miss out, so you've got to put it in. So what they've done is they've put it in at the end just to make sure it doesn't get missed out. And that tells you something about why they thought this story was significant. The next thing you need to know is that this is David at the start of his reign, and he's trying to work out what kind of leader he's going to be. And quite frankly, this is an occasion where he messes up spectacularly. If you know the stories of David, you'll know that this is not the only time he messes up spectacularly. David has a certain kind of habit of messing up. This is one of those additional occasions where he messes up. But the really important thing about David and his leadership is that when he messes up, he repents and sets things right. And this is another one of those stories where David messes up, he realizes he's messed up, and then he puts it right. And in order to understand this story, you've got to know your Old Testament really quite well. And the person who's writing this assumes you know your Old Testament really quite well. So just in case you haven't memorized the entirety of the Old Testament and know the stories all off by heart, I'm just going to help you out a little bit so you can understand it and put it in its context. Because this story assumes you know another story. And it's the other story that I'm going to tell you about now to put this story in its context. And the other story comes from the book of Joshua. So when the people of God are settling in the land, God told Joshua that what they must do is not make any relationships with anybody who lives in the land. Do go on to Joshua. Don't make any relationships with anybody who lives in the land. Stay separate from them. Stay as the people of God. And most importantly, don't make any pacts to be able to live with people in the land. Now, this story that I'm about to tell you, and we'll read it from Joshua in a moment, comes after Joshua and the people of God have fought the Battle of Jericho. Now, even if you don't know your Old Testament very well, sure, you will know the Battle of Jericho. I see someone's down there is singing the song quite rightly. Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. You know the story. Then there was a story about a place called Ai, in which a very similar thing happened, and Joshua fought and won against the people of Ai. Now, the people of Gibeon lived in that kind of area, not very far away at all, and they heard what had happened in Jericho and Ai. So this is where the story comes in. Joshua 9. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they, on their part, acted with cunning. And I absolutely love this little story. So they literally live about a mile away. But they decided that they would try and say to Joshua that they'd come a really, really long way. So they, on their part, acted with cunning. They went and prepared provisions. They found worn-out sacks for their donkeys and wineskins worn out and torn and mended. So like they've come a really, really long way. They found all the really worn-out stuff. Where I got to, wineskins worn out and torn and mended, with worn-out patch sandals on their feet, worn-out clothes, and all their provisions dry and mouldy. You can imagine them all kind of creating this scene. They ripped all their clothes, they got the oldest things out, they got the oldest sandals out, they got all the old sacks, and they went and found some mouldy food to make it look like they've come miles and miles and miles when they've only just come round the corner. And so they came kind of limping and looking really exhausted to Joshua. And they said to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, we are your... Oh, hang on, go back again. You've skipped a bit. There we go. They went to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal, and they said to him and to the Israelites, we've come from a far country. We're so tired. We've walked such a long way, having just come round the corner. And now make a treaty with us. But the Israelites, who had just kind of wanted to make sure that it was all right, said to the Hivites, another name for the Gibeonites, perhaps you live among us. How can we make a treaty with you? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you and where do you come from? They said to him, your servants have come from a very far country. Because of the name of the Lord your God, we have heard a report of him, all that he did in Egypt. Then goes on a little bit more, and then Joshua made peace with them, guaranteeing their lives by a treaty. So that's the background to this story. So the Gibeonites tricked the Israelites into making a covenant with them. Now, in the Old Testament, when you make a covenant, that is just made. You cannot break it. A covenant is a covenant is a covenant. Once a covenant is made, there is nothing you can do about it. It just stays. So therefore, Joshua was tricked into doing something against what God had told him to do. But it was done. There you go. And then we go on a few years to the time of King Saul. And when King Saul became king, he was really worried about this covenant that Joshua had made with the Gibeonites when he shouldn't have made the covenant with the Gibeonites. And so, therefore, Saul decided to punish the Gibeonites for what they'd done. Now, just bear in mind that we're talking here about, and I'm just trying to work out the maths of it, at least 100 years, if not more than that. So he was punishing their descendants. He wasn't punishing the people who did it. He was punishing the descendants of the people who'd done it. You don't get much about Saul in this story, but you get that sense that Saul decided that he was going to do the right thing. And this is the really interesting thing that comes out of this story. There's a whole load of people all over the place in this story trying to do the right thing. And in trying to do the right thing, do the wrong thing. It happens over and over again in the story. So Joshua tried to do the right thing and made a treaty with people he shouldn't have done. Saul tried to do the right thing in actually trying to fix the problem of Joshua. And Saul's grand idea to fix the problem of Joshua was that he was going to kill the Gibeonites because that would solve everything nicely, wouldn't it? Obviously, it didn't solve anything nicely. And the problem, of course, with having done that is that he didn't kill all of the Gibeonites, so the Gibeonites were absolutely furious. So then we have the next stage of the story, when the Gibeonites come on to King David and say, we've been punished by Saul, we want you to do something to make right what was wrong. So one of the interesting things in the passage that you just heard read was that you heard that there was a famine in the land. And David asked God why there was a famine in the land. And God said in response to the famine in the land that it was because there was blood guilt. I'm not on any of the slides at the moment, so keep it on Saul just for now. God said that that the reason for the famine in the land was to punish Saul for what he'd done to the Gibeonites. So what you've got then is David, who asked God what had gone wrong. God said, there's a famine because of the Gibeonites. What are we going to do? So David comes up with his good idea about how we're going to solve the problem. So keep in mind all of these layers upon layers of people trying to solve a problem. So you've got Joshua was tricked in the first place. Saul's great idea was to kill the Gibeonites. That would solve that nicely, won't it? Didn't solve it nicely. Gibeonites came to David and said, what are you going to do about it? Interestingly, David... one of the things that was really important was that David initially did pray. There was a famine in the land. David prayed to God and asked him what he should do about it. And God said the reason there's a famine in the land is because of Saul. The problem is, David then didn't go back to God and say, well, what shall I do about it now? David came up with his own good idea. So you then had the next good idea. So the next good idea is that we'll solve the problem of the fact that there's a famine in the land. We'll kill 7 of Saul's sons, and that will solve the problem, won't it? And you can see the logic, kind of. But it's almost as though you've got people trying to solve problem after problem after problem by making another problem and another problem. And it's worth just pausing for a moment and going, isn't that just so like humans? That we go, here's a problem. I know, I've got a really good idea. I'm going to solve it by doing this. And then we do this, and it doesn't solve it. It kind of makes it worse. So we'll go, it's all right, we'll solve it by doing this. Oh, no, that didn't work either. And on we go. There's a phrase for what goes on in this story that is used by Old Testament scholars. It's called retributive justice. And retributive justice is something that feels like it's the right thing to do while being a disastrously wrong thing to do. So retributive justice is person A does something wrong. Person B is really upset about it. So what person B does is go back to person A and punish them for having done whatever it was that they did wrong. So person A then goes, well, now I've been wronged. So what I'm going to do is punish person B for what went wrong. And then person B goes, do you know what? I've been wronged. So I'm going to person, and on and on and on it goes. Retributive justice is the backwards and forwards that goes on and on and on. We all feel the need that we want justice. But the problem is retributive justice just makes more and more and more problems as time goes on. This is a story of the more and more and more problems as the time went on. So David's grand idea was that he was going to kill 7 of Saul's sons. Once Saul's sons were killed, the Gibeonites would have been happy, all was well. So he is trying to find his feet and find the right way to act. And he begins by asking God the reason for the famine, but comes up with his own solution. And so then he orders the killing of the 7 sons of Saul. And into this gory and miserable and horrible story comes our woman of courage. And the woman of courage is quite remarkable. If we can go on to the Rizpah slide now. Because one of the really interesting things is Rizpah is the only person in the story who actually has no power at all. She's got less than no power at all, in fact, because Rizpah was the concubine of the king who had died. So you may remember from the Old Testament that in the Old Testament period, kings would have wives and concubines. So wives were the ones who were officially married, and the concubines were the extra women that the king would have on the side. So she wasn't even the wife, she was a concubine. And she was the concubine of a king who had been killed by the king who was now in power. So if you want to talk about having no power, she was the one who had absolutely none whatsoever. She wasn't even the official widow of Saul. She was the concubine of Saul, who was now completely out of power and completely disgraced in the new regime that was David's. So what could Rizpah do? The answer is very, very little. But there was one thing that was open to her. And so Rizpah did the one thing that was open to her, which was that she went and sat by the bodies of the 7 people who had been killed. 2 of them were her sons, 5 of them were other people's sons. And it's worth just stopping there for a moment and thinking what it must have been like for Rizpah to sit there next to the bodies of the 2 sons that she had loved dearly and who had been killed by David in this weird blood guilt that was going backwards and forwards. And the trouble is, there's a little phrase in the story that makes us go, oh yeah, she went and sat on the mountain for a bit. What we don't appreciate is the length of time she sat there. So the phrase is, from the beginning of the barley harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens. Now, the barley harvest happens around the time of Passover in the Holy Land. So Passover is one of the things you may not know is that there were 3 harvest festivals in Israel, not 1. So you've got the first harvest, which is Passover, second harvest, which is Pentecost. So the first one is barley harvest, the second one is the wheat harvest, which happens at Pentecost, and then the third one is the harvest, the end of all the harvests. So the barley harvest is the first one of those. Happens around April time. Now, until the rain fell on them, the problem is when we read this story, if you imagine going to sit on a hill until the rain falls, you'll be there about 5 minutes, and then you'll be off home again. Whereas in the Holy Land, actually rain doesn't fall for the vast majority of the summer. I used to live there when I was an undergraduate student, and there was an elderly lady who was Palestinian, and we were talking about the weather one day, and she said, the rain will come on October the 21st. And I went, no, it won't. Guess when the rain came? October the 21st. It's very, very seasonal, the rains. So think about Rizpah, who sat on the mountain next to the bodies of her sons from April to October. And that little phrase of she was there just begins to give you that sense of precisely what was going on here. Rizpah sat there next to the bodies for 6 months or so. And it says that she beat off the wild birds and the wild animals. Now, in this part of the world, the wild birds you're thinking about are vultures. You're not thinking about pigeons and sparrows. You're thinking about vultures, the wild animals. They have mountain lions, they have leopards, those kinds of things. So she sat next to the bodies of her sons and these other 5 men for 6 months, beating off the vultures and the mountain lions. And eventually, what she was doing, the word of it, came to David. And this is where the really important thing happens in the story, is that the word came to David. And David did something really quite striking. He gathered up the bones of the 7 people who had been lying out on the mountain, so the 7 that he'd ordered to be killed, and he called for the bones of Saul and Jonathan to be buried. Now, this is a really, really interesting little bit of the story, and it's one of those things that if you're not reading it carefully, you just kind of go, oh, that's nice, he called for a burial. But let's just pause for a moment on the story of Saul and Jonathan. So Saul and Jonathan, you may remember from your reading of the Old Testament that Saul was David's nemesis. He was the king who fought against him. But Saul's son, Jonathan, was David's best friend. They were very, very close. They were kind of absolutely close friends. And in the end, when the great battle happened between Saul and David, Jonathan was, of course, fighting on his father's side and not on David's side. So Jonathan, therefore, was fighting against his best friend David. David was fighting against his best friend Jonathan. And it's just such a tragic story that these two were fighting against each other. And then Saul and Jonathan were killed in the final battle, and then David became king. And David did nothing about his best friend's body. He just left it. They died in Bethshan. The bones were taken into Jabesh Gilead, but he did nothing about it. Rizpah's action meant that David realized that what he'd done was completely wrong. And he buried not just the 7 people he had killed, but also Saul and Jonathan. And so what Rizpah did was she did the only thing she could do, which was to sit on the mountain and mourn for her children. But as a result, she changed the mind of a king. She caused David to realize what he'd got wrong. She caused him to realize that he'd been caught up by enmity and by fighting and by trying to find a justice that he simply couldn't find. And then he buried the bones of the 7 and of Saul and Jonathan. So Rizpah probably thought there was absolutely nothing she could do. She probably thought that it would have no impact at all. But what she did was change the mind of a king. And that, I think, is a most remarkable thing. And just stop and think about the courage it would have taken to be that woman sitting out on the mountainside, not knowing you could make any difference, not imagining that you could have any impact. We never hear her speak at all in the story. But Rizpah did what she could. And in doing what she could, she changed the mind of a king. She changed the course of a nation. It's the most important bit of this story, and we come to right at the end, where it says, and after David had buried the bones of the 7 and Saul and Jonathan, the famine ended. So actually, the message that David needed to hear was that not that justice ought to be got from somebody else, you shouldn't be carrying on this horrible bloodlust. Actually, forgiveness needs to break out. And what Rizpah managed to make David do was to repent and to forgive. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful story. So if we just go on to the slide with Malala, one of the people I think who reminds me today of Rizpah is Malala Yousafzai. You may remember her. She got the Nobel Peace Prize at the age of 17. She was shot by the Taliban at the age of 15 for attempting to protest for women and women being able to be educated in Pakistan. But one of the things that she says I think is really, really powerful. I don't want to be remembered as the girl who was shot. I want to be remembered as the girl who stood up. In this case, we've got Rizpah, who was the woman who sat down, but the idea is still the same. It is doing what you can in the face of really difficult circumstances. And sometimes all you can do is stand up, or sit down, or whatever you name it. But actually, it's what you do that can begin to make the difference. So as we draw to a close, I'd like to pray the words of an Australian poet. He's a poet and cartoonist, and one of my favourite commentators on all sorts of things. And it seems to me that actually what we're trying to do when we're reflecting on people like Rizpah, on the women of courage from the Bible, is to pray prayers like this. God, help us to change ourselves and to change our world, to know the need for it, to deal with the pain of it, to feel the joy of it, to undertake the journey without understanding the destination. The art of gentle revolution. Amen.